I remember that eerie night vividly. I was alone at home, a typical evening, until the usual quietness of my neighborhood took on an unsettling twist. It all began innocuously with a knock at the door. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a friendly woman from across the street. Initially, her concern seemed genuine, inquiring about my well-being in the most amiable way. At first, her friendly gestures were just that, friendly. But soon, her attention became a bit overwhelming. She'd show up unannounced, expressing concern over minor things like the curtains being drawn or the mailbox not being checked daily. Her seemingly caring demeanor turned into something more intrusive and unsettling. Initially, I brushed it off, attributing her actions to genuine neighborly concern. But as days went by, her concern morphed into overbearing attention. She would often linger longer than necessary, overstaying her welcome with persistent questions about my daily routine. It was like she was trying to insert herself into every aspect of my life, and it made me increasingly uncomfortable. Her visits grew frequent, almost incessant, and I started feeling uneasy about being alone in my own home. The line between genuine concern and invasive behavior blurred. Her presence felt more like an intrusion than neighborly care. She began making comments about my schedule, my habits, details that only someone closely watching would know. Her inquiries became more probing, asking about my plans and my movements as if she had a vested interest in every minute of my day. The paranoia started setting in slowly. I began checking my locks multiple times a day, wondering if Mrs. Thompson might try to come in when I wasn't looking. The constant feeling of being watched lingered, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end whenever I felt her gaze from across the street. At night, I would sometimes catch glimpses of her silhouette through the curtains, standing in the faint glow of the streetlights, watching. It sent shivers down my spine, this sense of being under constant surveillance, invaded in my own home by someone I once considered a friendly neighbor. I tried to confront her about her behavior, to politely express my discomfort, hoping she would understand and respect my boundaries. But each time, her demeanor shifted, veering from saccharine concern to a steely, almost sinister resolve. It was as if she was determined to pry into my life regardless of my discomfort. Her behavior became more unpredictable, sometimes leaving cryptic notes at my doorstep or making veiled comments about things I had never shared with her. The feeling of being watched intensified, turning my home from a haven into a place of unease and paranoia. I became hypervigilant, double-checking every corner of my home for any sign of intrusion. The once soothing solitude of my residence transformed into a claustrophobic nightmare, each creak of the floorboards or rustle of the curtains sending a jolt of fear through me. The constant barrage of Mrs. Thompson's unsolicited attention started taking a toll on my mental well-being. The fear of what she might do next, her sudden appearances, and probing inquiries weighed heavily on my mind. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if she was lurking in the shadows. Sleep became elusive, the fear of her unexpected visits haunting my nights. The sense of security in my own home shattered, replaced by an overwhelming feeling of vulnerability and fear. I considered involving the authorities, but the lack of tangible evidence made me hesitant, unsure of how to address the situation without proof of her menacing behavior. My world seemed to shrink, confined within the walls of my home, a sanctuary that had now become a prison of fear. I started avoiding going out, fearful of bumping into her, and the once familiar streets became a maze of apprehension. Finally, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I caught sight of her at the end of the street, watching my house. The sight was enough to send me into a panicked frenzy. I decided to leave, seeking refuge with a friend until I could figure out how to handle the unnerving situation. I left that night, carrying the weight of fear and uncertainty. Mrs. Thompson's once friendly concern had mutated into a nightmarish invasion of privacy, a terrifying experience that left me questioning the safety of my own home. I was home alone one evening, wrapped up in my own world after a long day's work. The gentle hum of the television provided a soothing background noise, the only company in my quiet house. The evening was uneventful until a knock echoed through the stillness. Curious, I made my way to the front door, wondering who could be calling at this late hour. Peering through the peephole, I saw a figure standing on the porch. A young man, dressed in a crisp suit, held a brochure and a determined expression. Assuming he was a door-to-door salesman, I hesitated, debating whether to open the door or not. But then, thinking it would be a brief interaction, I decided to see what he wanted. I opened the door, greeted by a practiced smile. He launched into his rehearsed spiel, trying to sell me something I had no interest in. I politely declined, explaining that I wasn't interested in whatever he was offering. But instead of taking the rejection gracefully, his smile faltered, replaced by a steely glare. Undeterred by my refusal, he persisted, growing increasingly aggressive in his attempts to sway my decision. His tone shifted from polite to forceful, his insistence becoming uncomfortable. I tried to end the conversation, telling him firmly that I wasn't interested and asked him to leave. But my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He grew bolder, edging closer to the doorway, invading my personal space. My heart began to race, a sense of unease creeping over me. I asked him to leave again, more forcefully this time, but he refused to budge. His demeanor changed, his eyes glinting with an unsettling intensity. My attempts at closing the door were futile. He wedged his foot in, preventing it from shutting completely. Panic began to simmer within me as the situation escalated. His insistence turned menacing, and I could feel a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I attempted to reason with him, hoping to de-escalate the situation. But he seemed beyond reason, driven by some unexplained determination to make his way inside. His persistence was becoming alarming, and I realized I was facing a stranger who wouldn't take no for an answer. Adrenaline surged through me as I frantically searched for a solution. My mind raced, considering various options to handle the unnerving situation. I was alone, facing a persistent and increasingly aggressive stranger on my doorstep. I knew I had to act quickly to protect myself. The atmosphere turned tense, a heavy silence settling between us. His relentless attempts to gain entry fueled my growing panic. My instinct screamed at me to defend my home and my safety. I knew I had to take control of the situation before it spiraled further out of hand. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I firmly demanded that he leave immediately or I would call the authorities. It was a final warning, a last attempt to make him understand the severity of his actions. But his response was chilling, a cold smirk dancing on his lips. In a terrifying turn of events, he began to raise his voice, his demands turning more aggressive and threatening. His behavior sent shivers down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I felt trapped, the situation veering into a nightmare I never anticipated. Fear coursed through me, a feeling of helplessness engulfing my senses. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the gravity of the situation. I was alone, facing an intruder who was determined to breach the sanctity of my home. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as possible. My hand shook as I reached for the phone, dialing the emergency number, my voice trembling as I explained the urgent situation to the operator. The moments that followed were an eternity, my heart racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. I could hear the sound of his fists pounding against the door, his shouts of anger reverberating through the house. I prayed for the authorities to arrive soon, my anxiety peaking with each passing second. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Relief washed over me as I heard the approaching police car. The intruder's aggressive attempts ceased abruptly, and I heard the muffled exchange outside the door. The police arrived just in time, their authoritative voices calming the chaos. They swiftly detained the intruder, escorting him away from my home. I was left shaken, my mind reeling from the harrowing encounter. As I sat in the aftermath of the terrifying ordeal, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability and fear. The encounter with the persistent solicitor had turned a routine visit into a chilling confrontation. It was a typical day, sunlight streaming through the windows, casting warm hues across the room. I'd been juggling work from home and the usual household chores, but the hum of the malfunctioning air conditioning unit had been a constant nuisance. Finally, I decided to call in a repairman to fix it. Little did I know, that decision would spiral into an unnerving encounter. The repairman arrived promptly, his demeanor friendly and professional. He introduced himself as John, a seasoned technician, and I welcomed him in, glad that the problem would soon be resolved. He seemed polite, chatting amicably as he inspected the faulty unit. But as he worked, a feeling of unease crept over me. There was something off about his demeanor, a subtle shift in his behavior that made my skin prickle with discomfort. It was nothing I could quite place my finger on, just a gut feeling nudging at the edges of my awareness. While he tinkered with the air conditioning, I busied myself, tidying up nearby. That's when I noticed something unsettling. A fleeting glance at his toolbox revealed an assortment of tools that didn't quite seem necessary for the job at hand. Intrigued and concerned, I found myself discreetly watching him as he worked, my unease growing. His actions became increasingly furtive, almost as though he was trying to conceal something. He was overly cautious, casting wary glances around the room and fumbling with tools that appeared to serve no purpose for fixing the unit. The atmosphere grew tense, an inexplicable sense of danger seeping into the room. I felt a surge of panic rising within me, my heart pounding in my chest as my mind raced with apprehension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, a gnawing fear that I was in the presence of someone with ulterior motives. Attempting to quell my escalating anxiety, I tried engaging in casual conversation, hoping to decipher the reason behind his peculiar behavior. But the repairman remained evasive, his responses curt and dismissive, adding to the growing sense of dread coiling within me. As the minutes ticked by, his actions grew more erratic, his movements becoming rushed and jittery. His gaze lingered on me a little too long, sending shivers down my spine. The friendly facade he had presented when he arrived now seemed like a veil masking a darker intent. I found myself inching away, instinctively seeking distance from the repairman as a wave of fear washed over me. His presence felt suffocating, suffused with an unsettling energy that made every nerve in my body scream with apprehension. A deep sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach as I contemplated the situation. The evidence, though subtle, hinted at something far more sinister than a mere repair job. Every fiber of my being urged me to escape the confines of my home, to flee from the potential threat looming within the walls. Summoning every ounce of courage, I decided to confront the repairman about my growing discomfort. But as I voiced my concerns, his demeanor shifted drastically. His friendly mask slipped away, revealing a menacing glare that sent a chill down my spine. With a sudden burst of fear, I realized I was in a perilous situation. There was an unspoken threat in his eyes, a malevolent intent that made my blood run cold. Panic surged through me, and I knew I had to act fast. Summoning all my strength, I made a swift move to reach the door, desperate to escape the looming danger. The repairman's actions turned aggressive, blocking my path and demanding my compliance with a chilling intensity. In a moment of sheer terror, I managed to break free from his grasp and dashed out, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled to safety. Adrenaline fueled my escape, my mind racing with the harrowing encounter that had unfolded in the sanctity of my own home. I called the authorities, my voice trembling as I recounted the unsettling events. They arrived promptly, but the repairman was nowhere to be found, leaving behind an unsettling sense of vulnerability and fear. In the aftermath, I couldn't shake the lingering terror, haunted by the encounter with a seemingly innocuous repairman who harbored hidden motives. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary when the shrill ring of the phone pierced through the serene atmosphere. Curiosity nudged me to answer, and I hesitantly picked up the receiver. A frantic voice greeted me, a stranger pleading for help. They claimed to be in distress, lost in the labyrinth of the city streets, seeking refuge from an unseen danger. My heart raced, empathy rising within me for this seemingly helpless individual seeking aid. The caller's voice trembled, weaving a tale of desperation that pulled at my compassionate strings. They begged for directions, claiming to be stranded in an unfamiliar neighborhood, in dire need of shelter and safety. Feeling a surge of concern, I tried to gather as much information as I could from the frantic caller, their pleas growing more urgent by the second. They described landmarks and street signs, painting a vivid picture of their supposed plight. As I listened intently, a sense of unease began to gnaw at me. There was something off about the conversation, a subtle discrepancy in the caller's story that triggered a faint alarm in my mind. Despite the pleas for help, an unsettling feeling crept over me, a whisper of doubt clouding the authenticity of the caller's distress. Skepticism mingled with concern as I attempted to validate their claims, probing with questions to discern the truth behind the unsettling call. But as the conversation progressed, their story started to unravel. Inconsistencies surfaced, small details that didn't add up, casting a shadow of doubt over the caller's authenticity. My instincts urged caution, warning me of the potential danger lurking beneath the surface of the seemingly helpless plea for aid. A wave of dread washed over me as I realized the possibility of being lured into a dangerous trap, a prey to a sinister scheme masked behind a distressing facade. The urgency in the caller's voice heightened, their pleas growing more desperate, pushing for me to provide immediate help. But a chilling realization dawned upon me. I was the intended victim in this harrowing plot. With a racing heart and trembling hands, I made a swift decision. Ignoring the caller's insistence, I calmly informed them that I couldn't help, citing a lack of knowledge about the area they described. I swiftly ended the call, a knot of fear tightening in my chest. Dread lingered in the air, a palpable sense of relief mixed with lingering apprehension. I locked all the doors and windows, ensuring every entry point to my sanctuary was secure. Fear had woven itself into the fabric of my once peaceful evening, turning my home into an uncertain fortress. The night stretched on, each passing moment thick with unease. Every sound outside, every passing car or distant footstep, sent a jolt of anxiety through my veins. The unsettling call had shaken the foundation of my sense of security, leaving me vulnerable and exposed. I found myself peering through the curtains, checking the dimly lit streets outside, half expecting to catch a glimpse of someone lurking in the shadows. Paranoia clung to me like a second skin, the possibility of danger lurking just beyond the safety of my front door. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind haunted by the sinister call and the potential peril it had hinted at. The hours crawled by, and the darkness outside seemed to amplify the feeling of isolation and vulnerability. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, casting a faint glow in the room, a sense of relief washed over me. The night had passed without any further disturbances, but the lingering fear remained etched in my mind. The unsettling experience served as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk beneath seemingly innocent facades. I took precautions, informing the authorities about the distressing call and remaining vigilant, wary of any further attempts to compromise my safety. It was a usual evening for me, just like any other. I was winding down, scrolling through my social media feed, when a direct message popped up from someone I vaguely recognized. We had connected through a shared interest, engaging in casual conversations about hobbies and interests. But tonight, something felt different. The messages had taken an unsettling turn, becoming more personal, invasive, and uncomfortably persistent. I tried to brush off the unease creeping in, attributing it to misinterpretation or overthinking. But as the messages continued, their tone grew increasingly insistent, crossing boundaries that left me feeling unnerved. I decided to pull back, limiting my responses and distancing myself from the interaction, hoping the situation would fizzle out. Yet, that hope was shattered when I heard a soft but persistent knocking at the door. My heart skipped a beat, the sound echoing through the quiet house. I hesitated, my mind racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. I cautiously approached the door, my unease escalating with each step. As I peered through the peephole, dread coiled in my stomach. There, standing on the porch, was the person from my social media interactions. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, a feeling of vulnerability creeping over me. How did they find my address? What were they doing here? Their demeanor seemed innocuous, a smile painted across their face, but it didn't alleviate the rising fear within me. I didn't invite them, and their sudden appearance was deeply unsettling. Ignoring the pounding of my heart, I slowly cracked the door open, keeping a cautious distance. They greeted me as if it were a casual visit, their demeanor unnervingly calm. They spoke as if our online interactions warranted an in-person meetup. Panic began to grip me, my mind reeling with the realization that this person had crossed a line, invading the sanctity of my home uninvited. I tried to maintain composure, masking the mounting fear with a polite but firm tone, explaining that their unexpected visit was unwelcome. But their persistence was jarring, dismissing my discomfort and insisting on engaging in a face-to-face conversation. With each passing moment, the situation grew more precarious. They edged closer, their boundary-crossing behavior escalating, ignoring my attempts to set clear boundaries and respect my personal space. I felt trapped, a sense of vulnerability engulfing me as their presence loomed over me. My mind raced with fear and uncertainty, contemplating the best course of action. I knew I needed to defuse the situation, to make them leave before things spiraled further out of control. But their refusal to acknowledge my discomfort only heightened my panic. Desperation set in, my voice trembling as I firmly reiterated that they needed to leave. Yet, their response was chillingly dismissive, as if my concerns were inconsequential. The fear that had been brewing within me now surged to the surface, a tidal wave of apprehension crashing down. Summoning all my courage, I made a swift move to close the door, my hands trembling with fear. But they resisted, their persistence bordering on aggression. Panic enveloped me as I struggled against their invasive attempts to enter, their unsettling behavior triggering a fight-or-flight response. In a surge of adrenaline, I managed to shut and lock the door, the sound of it clicking sending a wave of relief through me. But the sense of dread lingered, my mind reeling from the chilling encounter that had just unfolded in my own home. I felt violated, vulnerable, and utterly shaken by the invasive intrusion. I immediately contacted the police, my voice shaking as I recounted the harrowing experience. They arrived promptly, but the person had vanished by the time they reached my home, leaving behind an unsettling atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. In the aftermath, I grappled with a deep sense of violation and unease. The invasion of my privacy and the disregard for my boundaries had left a mark on me forever. As I sat reading, I glanced out at the sprawling garden, watching the gardener, Mr. Turner, tending to the plants with his usual diligence. Mr. Turner had been our gardener for years, a friendly and trustworthy man, or so I had always thought. But lately, something about his behavior had been unsettling me. It was nothing tangible, just a nagging feeling that crawled under my skin whenever I crossed paths with him. There were times when his friendly demeanor felt forced, his smile strained, leaving an unsettling impression that lingered long after our interactions. I tried to shrug it off, attributing it to an overactive imagination or my own paranoia. But as the days passed, my unease grew, my mind conjuring scenarios where his intentions were more sinister than they appeared. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I noticed Mr. Turner lingering in the garden longer than usual. His presence felt oppressive, and a knot formed in my stomach, an inexplicable sense of being watched intensifying my unease. I tried to distract myself, immersing in a book to shake off the sense of foreboding that settled like a heavy shroud. But as darkness cloaked the house, a feeling of vulnerability washed over me, amplified by the absence of any other soul nearby. It was well into the night when a sudden noise outside jolted me from my uneasy slumber. My heart raced as I peered through the window, trying to discern the source of the disturbance. Shadows danced eerily in the moonlight, casting macabre shapes across the garden. I hesitated, debating whether to investigate or retreat to the safety of my locked doors. My nerves frayed, every creak of the floorboards echoing like an ominous warning. With trembling hands, I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed towards the back door, the sense of dread escalating with each step. As I cautiously stepped into the garden, the air felt charged with tension. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the familiar surroundings, but everything seemed different, sinister almost. My heart pounded against my chest as I searched for the source of the disturbance. Suddenly, movement caught my eye near the edge of the garden. My breath caught in my throat as I made out Mr. Turner's figure, crouched near the bushes. Panic surged within me, and I called out, my voice quivering, demanding an explanation for his presence at such an hour. But he remained silent, unmoving, his figure frozen in the darkness. Fear gripped me, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, urging me to retreat to the safety of my home. I turned to flee when I heard his voice, low and chilling, cutting through the stillness of the night. He spoke in cryptic phrases, his words twisted with a hidden meaning that sent shivers down my spine. He mentioned things that were unnervingly personal, things he shouldn't have known. I felt exposed, vulnerable in the grasp of someone whose intentions I couldn't decipher. My instinct screamed at me to run, to seek refuge, but fear rooted me to the spot. His eerie words and unsettling demeanor paralyzed me, the minutes dragging on like an eternity as I stood there, frozen in terror. Suddenly, Mr. Turner lunged forward, his actions aggressive and unpredictable. Panic engulfed me as I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. I scrambled, my heart pounding in my ears, racing towards the sanctuary of my home. With adrenaline coursing through me, I reached the door, fumbling to unlock it, my fingers trembling with fear. The fear of what could happen if he caught up to me pushed me to move faster, my mind clouded with sheer terror. Finally, the door swung open, and I darted inside, slamming it shut behind me, locking it with a trembling hand. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering against my chest as I pressed myself against the door, straining to hear any sound from outside. The night stretched on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity, the darkness outside amplifying the terror within me. I called the authorities, my voice shaking as I relayed the chilling encounter with Mr. Turner, every word punctuated by sheer terror. The authorities arrived swiftly, combing through the area, but found no trace of Mr. Turner. Their assurances of increased patrols and vigilance did little to ease the gnawing fear that clung to me, a sense of vulnerability that refused to dissipate. The evening was settling in, and the house was quiet, just me, alone, in the comfort of my home. It felt peaceful at first, the familiar silence wrapping around me like a blanket. But as darkness draped over the neighborhood, a sense of unease began to creep in. That unease wasn't unfounded. The doorbell echoed through the house, shattering the quietude. I hesitated before peering through the peephole, and my heart skipped a beat. There she stood, Miss Thompson, the former babysitter from years ago. Her sudden appearance sent a jolt of unease through me. I remembered her from my childhood, a reliable babysitter, but there was something off about her now. She looked anxious, her eyes darting around as if expecting trouble. Reluctantly, I opened the door, hoping to alleviate whatever emergency she claimed to have. She appeared distressed, fumbling with her words, explaining that her car had broken down nearby, and she needed to use the phone urgently. A dubious excuse, but I let her in, feeling a pang of guilt leaving her stranded outside. As she entered, her nervous energy seemed to fill the room, infusing the air with a palpable tension. I offered her the phone, but she declined, insisting she needed to use the restroom. Her behavior was erratic, and a sense of discomfort lingered as I led her down the hall. Minutes ticked by, and a creeping feeling of anxiety gnawed at me. I started to question her motives. Why was she really here? Her emergency story didn't add up, and her presence felt suffocating. I debated calling for help, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. When she emerged from the restroom, her demeanor had shifted. She appeared calmer, but had a strange intensity in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to make small talk, but the conversation felt forced and strained. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for something, her gaze lingering on the family photos with an unsettling fixation. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense, the air thick with unspoken apprehension. I was on edge, a growing sense of dread seeping into every fiber of my being. The longer she stayed, the more uncomfortable I felt in my own home. I attempted to gently hint that it was getting late, hoping she would take the cue to leave, but she didn't budge. Instead, she lingered, making me feel more uneasy with every passing moment. Her presence felt intrusive, invasive almost, and a knot of fear tightened in my stomach. The night stretched on, the clock ticking away each agonizing second. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but her presence had me on edge. I kept making excuses, subtly hinting that I needed to turn in for the night, but she remained stubbornly rooted in the living room. As the clock struck midnight, her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She started pacing, muttering to herself in hushed tones that sent shivers down my spine. I felt trapped, the walls of my own home closing in on me, suffocating me with fear and anxiety. Suddenly, she turned to me, her gaze piercing, and started speaking in a frantic, almost manic tone. Her words were disjointed, a mix of apologies, cryptic messages, and veiled threats that sent my heart racing. My mind spun with questions, trying to decipher her intentions, but nothing made sense. I tried to maintain composure, attempting to coax her to leave, but she seemed fixated on something that I couldn't comprehend. Her presence had become suffocating, an ominous cloud hanging over my home. The situation escalated when she made veiled references to events from my childhood, events that no stranger should have known. Fear gripped me, the realization sinking in that this wasn't an ordinary visit, it was something darker, something deeply unsettling. The night felt endless, my home becoming a prison, trapping me with this intruder whose intentions were shrouded in mystery. I felt vulnerable, helpless against her unnerving behavior. I managed to reach for my phone, my trembling fingers dialing for help. But just as I was about to press the call button, she lunged forward, grabbing my arm in a vice-like grip, her eyes wild with desperation. Panic coursed through me, adrenaline flooding my veins as I struggled to break free. My heart raced, each beat drumming the urgency of the situation. With a surge of strength, I wrenched myself away, stumbling backward in terror. In a flurry of movement, I bolted for the door, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I dashed outside, not daring to look back until I reached safety. Gasping for breath, I frantically dialed the authorities, relaying the chilling ordeal that had unfolded in my own home. The authorities arrived swiftly, but Miss Thompson was nowhere to be found. They searched the area thoroughly, offering reassurances, but the sense of terror lingered long after she vanished into the night. I remember that summer vividly. It was the first time I moved into my new home, a quaint place tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. I cherished the peace it brought me. Yet, that tranquility soon began to unravel. It all started one morning when the postman delivered an innocuous-looking parcel. The sender's address was unfamiliar, and there was no return label. Inside, I found an old photograph, weathered and faded, depicting a family gathered in front of my house. The unsettling part? It wasn't my family, it was the previous owners. I shrugged it off as a mix-up, attributing it to the relocation process. But then came the letters, cryptic messages hinting at a shared history, vague references to secrets hidden within the house's walls. They spoke of an enigmatic past that wasn't mine, a mysterious narrative that seemed to seep from the very structure I called home. With each subsequent delivery, my unease grew. The letters were meticulous, each word crafted to instill fear, to stir up the unknown. They hinted at an unresolved history, a puzzle I had unwittingly stepped into. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lingering on me. The once familiar rooms felt alien, their shadows harboring secrets I couldn't fathom. At night, the silence felt oppressive, the creaks and groans of the house magnified into eerie echoes. The letters, always arriving at irregular intervals, continued to disturb my peace. They alluded to hidden compartments, forgotten diaries, and whispered rumors of something dark lurking beneath the house's foundations. Each message hinted at an imminent revelation, fueling my trepidation. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth, scouring every nook and cranny for hidden clues. I pored over old records, researched the house's history, seeking any connection to the cryptic messages that plagued me. But my efforts only deepened the sense of dread that consumed me. My once beloved home had transformed into a maze of uncertainty, a place I longed to escape. The fear of the unknown had taken root, its tendrils sneaking through every corner of my existence. The dread reached its peak one stormy night when a heavy parcel arrived. Its contents, an assortment of aged documents and a faded journal, chronicled the previous owner's descent into madness. The entries spoke of whispers in the walls, strange occurrences, and an inexplicable terror that had driven them to the brink. As I delved deeper into the journal's pages, the storm outside intensified, its fury matching the chaos brewing within me. The words penned in that journal were hauntingly familiar, mirroring the unsettling events that had unfolded since I moved in. The house creaked and groaned in harmony with the howling wind, as if the very structure was protesting my exploration into its buried secrets. The once familiar rooms now felt claustrophobic, their walls closing in on me. In a moment of terror, I realized I wasn't alone. I felt a presence, an otherworldly sensation creeping through the house. A chilling whisper danced on the edges of my hearing, sending shivers down my spine. Panic surged through me, adrenaline coursing as I darted from room to room, seeking refuge from the inexplicable fear gripping my soul. The storm raged outside, the rain pelting against the windows like an ominous warning. I felt trapped, the house suffocating me with its ancient mysteries, its unsettling energy. In a sudden frenzy, I grabbed the journal and the parcels, fleeing outside into the storm. I stood on the rain-soaked pavement, gasping for breath, my heart pounding against the chaotic rhythm of the tempest. As the downpour drenched me, I flung the parcels away, tossing them as far from me as possible, as if discarding a malevolent entity. The rain washed over me, cleansing me of the palpable terror that had gripped my being. The night swallowed the cryptic parcels, their contents scattered and lost to the deluge. I stood there, drenched and trembling, as the storm gradually subsided, leaving me alone in the eerie calm. I didn't return to retrieve those parcels. I didn't dare venture back into the house, haunted by the specter of a history I couldn't comprehend. I walked away, leaving behind the enigmatic past that had wrapped its tendrils around my new home, determined to leave its sinister secrets buried in the rain-soaked soil. I remember that evening like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. I was home alone, maybe around 10 or 11 years old, with my parents out for a late dinner. The house was quiet, the only sounds were from the television in the living room. Then, there was a knock at the door, something that, on any other day, wouldn't have been a big deal. I peeked through the peephole and saw a woman standing there, smiling. She said she was a friend of my mom's, someone I didn't recognize. She seemed friendly enough, but something about her smile didn't sit right with me. It felt forced, almost unnatural, sending a shiver down my spine. She insisted that I open the door, saying she had something important to discuss with my mom. But I remembered my parents' warnings about opening the door to strangers, especially when I was alone. I told her my mom wasn't available and that she could leave a message or call back later. But she persisted, her tone growing more urgent, almost demanding. My heart began to race. I knew I had to stay cautious, that something about this situation felt off. I stood my ground, repeating that my mom wasn't home and I couldn't let her in. Her insistence turned into frustration, her smile fading into an icy stare that sent a chill down my spine. I took a step back from the door, keeping it firmly shut, feeling a mix of fear and uncertainty. The woman's demeanor shifted abruptly, and she grew agitated, her tone becoming forceful as she demanded to be let inside. Her persistence was alarming, and I could feel panic setting in. I rushed to the phone, my hands trembling as I dialed my mom's number. But there was no answer. I glanced back at the door and saw the woman still standing there, her demeanor growing more unsettling by the second. As I hung up the phone, I could see her reaching for the doorknob, attempting to force her way in. Panic surged through me, and I bolted to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer. My heart raced, and my hand shook as I clutched the weapon, hoping I wouldn't have to use it. The woman's persistent knocking grew louder, almost frantic. I could hear her muttering something outside the door, her voice a mix of frustration and anger. It sent chills down my spine, a feeling of pure terror gripping me as I backed away from the entrance. The seconds felt like hours as I stood there, knife in hand, trying to muster the courage to face whatever was on the other side of that door. My mind raced, thoughts swirling with the worst-case scenarios. Then, suddenly, the knocking ceased. Silence enveloped the house, broken only by the pounding of my heart. I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole once more. The woman was gone, vanished into the night without a trace. I stood there, trembling and terrified, my mind reeling from the encounter. I knew I had narrowly avoided something deeply unsettling, something that could have ended in unimaginable horror. It was a chilling experience that left me shaken to the core, a memory etched into my mind forever. From that day on, I was always extra cautious when home alone. That encounter taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of staying vigilant, of trusting my instincts, and never opening the door to someone I didn't know, no matter how convincing they seemed. As I sat in the dimly lit living room, the silence enveloped the house, amplifying the feeling of solitude. My husband was hospitalized due to an unexpected illness, and I found myself alone, the house seeming unfamiliar in its quietness. I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, keeping busy with household chores and work. But something felt off, a niggling sense of unease that I couldn't shake. One evening, while sorting through bills in the study, I noticed something peculiar, a blinking light on the security panel. My heart skipped a beat as I approached it, realizing it was an indicator of recent system activity. But we hadn't triggered the alarm. Fear gnawed in my gut as I scanned the logs, discovering unauthorized access and modifications to the security settings. Panic set in. How could this be possible? Who would compromise our home security system, and for what purpose? My thoughts raced, and the feeling of vulnerability in my own home was suffocating. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, feeling a sense of paranoia creeping in. Every creak of the house sent shivers down my spine. Was someone watching? Was someone inside? I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on me. As the night fell, I felt a chill in the air, even with the heating turned up. Every small noise made me jump, my senses on high alert. I double-checked the doors, drew the curtain shut, and tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But the nagging feeling persisted. My phone buzzed, startling me. A notification from the security system. Another attempt to access the cameras. Fear gripped me like a vice. I dialed the police, explaining the situation, but they couldn't offer much help beyond suggesting I stay vigilant and call back if something more concrete happened. The hours ticked by slowly. I clutched my phone tightly, every ring of it setting my heart racing. I switched off the lights, hoping to obscure any glimpse of movement from the outside. My eyes scanned every shadow, every corner, looking for any sign of intrusion. The sound of a distant noise made me freeze. Was it a footstep? A door creaking? Or just my imagination playing tricks on me? I didn't dare move, holding my breath as the silence returned, deafening in its intensity. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, the dread twisting my stomach into knots. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if someone was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike? I cursed the vulnerability of being home alone, the sense of helplessness growing with each passing moment. I clutched a heavy book in my trembling hands, my heart pounding against my chest. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch, the tension in the air palpable. I contemplated calling a neighbor or a friend, but stopped, not wanting to alarm anyone without concrete evidence of danger. The night felt endless, a cycle of fear and paranoia, each shadow morphing into a potential threat. I felt as though I was drowning in a sea of uncertainty, unable to discern between reality and my growing paranoia. The first light of dawn filtered through the windows, bringing a sliver of relief. I hadn't heard anything since that distant noise. I cautiously checked the security system. It showed no recent activity. Maybe it was just a glitch, my mind playing tricks on me in the stress of my husband's absence. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. With the morning sun casting its glow on the walls, the house felt less foreboding. But the fear lingered, the unsettling realization that my home, my sanctuary, was breached, and that I was exposed to an unknown threat. I called the security company, arranging for an immediate inspection and an upgrade of the system. I couldn't afford to take any chances. I remained on edge for the days that followed, constantly checking and rechecking the locks, the windows, and the security system, never quite able to shake off the haunting feeling that I was being watched. My husband returned home, blissfully unaware of the ordeal I had faced. I never divulged the details, not wanting to worry him. But the experience left an indelible mark on me, a constant reminder of the fragility of security and the terror of feeling vulnerable in one's own home. The night began just like any other. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me home alone in our cozy suburban house. It was a quiet evening, the soft glow of the living room lamp casting a warm ambience. I was catching up on some reading, savoring the peace and solitude when the doorbell rang, shattering the tranquility. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man in a uniform, claiming to be from the local gas company, here for a routine inspection. He seemed professional, holding what looked like identification. I hesitated, but then again, it seemed plausible. I reluctantly opened the door, allowing him in. He went about his inspection, checking the gas lines, the furnace, and the appliances. I watched him closely, a lingering feeling of unease settling in. There was something off about his demeanor, a forced politeness that didn't sit well with me. As he wrapped up, he handed me a document, claiming it was for the records. I skimmed through it, but something felt amiss. The fine print seemed out of place, the font not quite right. When I asked him about it, his demeanor shifted, becoming more assertive. He insisted it was standard protocol and hurriedly made his way to the door. I closed the door behind him, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. The document he left seemed like a contract, requiring my signature for some sort of service. It didn't make sense. I wasn't expecting any work to be done, especially not without prior notice. A few hours later, as the night deepened, the phone rang. It was another person claiming to be from the gas company, asking about the service provided earlier. I was taken aback. How did they get my number? They sounded insistent, pressing me to confirm the details and even asking for sensitive information. Alarm bells rang in my head. I refused to divulge anything, hanging up hastily. But then, a sense of dread settled in. Was it really the gas company calling, or was it all part of a larger scheme? I felt like a target, a pawn in an elaborate scam that threatened the sanctity of my home. I checked all the doors and windows, ensuring they were securely locked. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and increasingly paranoid. Every sound outside seemed amplified, every shadow cast by the streetlights appeared menacing. The minutes ticked by painfully slow, and the darkness outside seemed to encroach on the safety of my home. I tried to distract myself, turning on all the lights, trying to create an illusion of safety and security. But the fear lingered, an unshakable feeling that I was being watched, monitored by an unknown threat. A knock on the door sent my heart racing. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was the same man from earlier, accompanied by another person. They claimed to have left something behind and needed to retrieve it. My instincts screamed danger. I refused to open the door, telling them to come back during business hours. Their insistence grew, their voices becoming more forceful. I backed away, feeling a surge of panic. What if they tried to force their way in? I called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. But as I waited for their arrival, fear consumed me. What if they managed to break in before help arrived? I felt trapped, cornered in my own home by these strangers with malicious intent. The minutes dragged on, each passing second feeling like an eternity. I could hear them outside, their voices becoming more agitated. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Were they armed? Would they try to break in? Finally, the sound of police sirens pierced the night. I felt a surge of relief, but the fear hadn't dissipated entirely. I stayed hidden until I heard the police officers' voices, confirming their arrival. I cautiously opened the door, explaining the situation in a rush of words. They checked the perimeter, but the strangers had vanished. The officers assured me they would patrol the area throughout the night, providing me with a sense of temporary security. But the ordeal had left me shaken, my home no longer the sanctuary it once was. I didn't sleep that night. The fear lingered, the realization that I had narrowly escaped a potentially dangerous situation sinking in. The organized scam, the calculated attempts to breach my home's safety, left me feeling violated and fearful, even within the familiar walls of my house. In the days that followed, I heightened the security measures, installing additional locks and a security system. But the experience haunted me, a constant reminder of the vulnerability that comes with being targeted by those with deceitful intentions. My husband returned home, and I recounted the harrowing events, feeling both relief at his presence and a lingering sense of unease. We reported the incident to the authorities, hoping to prevent anyone else from falling victim to such a sinister scheme. I was home alone on a quiet evening, the house wrapped in a comforting silence. My wife had gone on a work trip, leaving me to spend the night in solitude. The doorbell's chime shattered the tranquility, and I approached cautiously, peeking through the peephole. It was Jake, an old acquaintance I hadn't seen in years. We had drifted apart after a fallout. I hesitated, but courtesy pushed me to open the door. Jake stood there, rain-soaked and looking disheveled, claiming his car broke down, and he needed shelter for the night. I was taken aback, but my sense of hospitality nudged me to let him in. Once inside, Jake's demeanor was off, like there was something he wasn't telling me. He seemed jittery, his eyes darting around the house as if searching for something. His stories about the car breakdown felt fragmented, incomplete. I tried to shrug it off, attributing it to the unexpected visit. As the evening wore on, Jake's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He fiddled with things, rifling through cabinets and drawers, his curiosity crossing boundaries. I tried to maintain composure, but unease gnawed at me. I could feel the tension in the air, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. When I confronted Jake about his invasive behavior, he dismissed it with a nervous laugh, blaming it on exhaustion. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. I decided to offer him a bed for the night, but I couldn't relax. Late into the night, as I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned, an unshakable feeling of dread creeping in. That's when I heard it, the faint creak of footsteps outside my bedroom door. Panic surged through me, and I strained to hear more. Was someone in the house? I summoned all my courage and cautiously stepped out, my heart pounding. The house was dark, shrouded in eerie silence. I checked each room, the sense of dread growing with every step. The living room, the kitchen, everything seemed undisturbed. Just as I was about to return to bed, I heard a stifled sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the closet in the hallway. My blood ran cold. It was Jake's voice, muttering incomprehensible words. My heart raced as I approached the closet door, the feeling of danger palpable. As I opened it, Jake lunged out, his eyes wide with madness, a glint of menace reflecting in them. He had a knife in his hand. I stumbled back in shock, my mind racing to comprehend the danger I was in. His words were frantic, nonsensical, and filled with malice. He lunged again, and I dodged, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I darted towards the front door, desperate to escape the horror unfolding in my own home. I fumbled with the lock, panic clouding my movements. Jake was closing in, his every step echoing like a nightmare. I managed to unlock the door, flinging it open and sprinting into the chilling night. The cold rain drenched me as I ran, my heart pounding, and fear propelling me forward. I didn't dare look back, fearing Jake might be right behind me. I raced down the darkened street, my mind racing with terror and confusion. I had no plan, no destination, just a primal urge to get away. I reached a neighbor's house, pounding on the door, desperately seeking refuge and help. They called the police, and I recounted the horrifying events that unfolded in my home. The officers arrived promptly, and I led them back to my house, my heart pounding with trepidation. But when we entered, the house was empty, devoid of any trace of Jake. The officers searched the premises thoroughly, but Jake had vanished into the night, leaving behind a chilling memory. They took my statement and promised to investigate, but the terror of that night lingered, a reminder of the danger that lurked within the comfort of my own home. I stayed elsewhere that night, unable to shake off the horror. The police assured me they'd patrol the area and advised me to stay vigilant. I returned home cautiously the next day, shaken to the core. The incident left me rattled, forcing me to install extra security measures and constantly look over my shoulder. I reported the unsettling encounter with Jake to the authorities, but the mystery of his intentions remained unanswered. It was a reminder that danger could come knocking at your door in the form of someone you once knew, and the safety of home could easily be shattered by a chilling encounter with an unexpected menace. It was a typical evening. My wife had gone to visit her parents, leaving me alone in our home. I spent most of the evening catching up on work, nestled in the quietness of the house. As night fell, I decided to take a break and make myself dinner. That's when I noticed something peculiar. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of our neighbors across the street. It wasn't the usual chatter in their backyard. Instead, it was an eerie silence that caught my attention. Curiosity piqued, I peeked through the curtains, trying to discern what was happening. There they were, the usually amiable neighbors, huddled together in their backyard. The glow of torches illuminated their faces, distorted in the flickering light. My heart skipped a beat at the sight. Their murmured conversation and suspicious glances towards our house sent a chill down my spine. I dismissed it at first, attributing their gathering to a mere social event. But as the night deepened, the unease persisted. The clandestine meeting next door felt more ominous by the minute. I tried to focus on reading, but my mind kept wandering back to the disturbing sight I'd witnessed. The hours ticked by, and the stillness of the night was suffocating. A sudden noise outside jerked me out of my reverie. I cautiously approached the window, drawing the curtain aside to peek outside. Shadows moved in the darkness, figures lurking by our fence. My heart raced, and a shiver ran down my spine. Fear began to grip me as I realized these shadows seemed to be keeping an eye on our house. Paranoia consumed me, and I started to question whether it was a case of mistaken identity or something far more sinister. I retreated to the living room, the unease growing with every passing moment. The once comforting silence of the house now felt oppressive. I switched off the lights, trying to stay unnoticed, but the fear of being watched lingered, a relentless weight on my shoulders. I decided to call the police, my trembling fingers dialing the emergency number. I explained the situation, my voice trembling with anxiety. The dispatcher reassured me, promising a patrol car would be sent to investigate. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as I waited for help to arrive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, made my heart race. I tried to stay calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, the distant sound of sirens filled the air, and relief washed over me. The flashing lights outside illuminated the night as the police arrived. I rushed to the door to greet them, relief flooding my senses. The officers listened intently to my account of the eerie gathering and the suspicious shadows lurking around our house. They assured me they would investigate thoroughly, their professional demeanor providing some reassurance. As they patrolled the area and questioned the neighbors, I stayed locked inside, peering cautiously through the windows. The night felt endless, an endless loop of tension and fear. The police returned later, their faces grim. They explained that our neighbors had indeed been involved in suspicious activities, an underground group linked to organized crime. They had been surveilling our house, possibly targeting it for some unknown agenda. The news sent a chill down my spine. It was a revelation that shattered the illusion of safety in our tranquil neighborhood. The officers assured me of increased patrols and advised me to remain vigilant. I thanked them and locked every door and window, my mind plagued by fear. The realization that we had unwittingly become the focus of a dangerous faction made my blood run cold. That night, I hardly slept, the paranoia of being watched haunting my every thought. It was a rude awakening to the dangers lurking just beyond the facade of normalcy. I've been living alone in this small rented apartment for the past couple of years. It's always been a place of comfort and solace. But one evening, everything changed. It was a typical day. I was catching up on some work, lost in the hum of my laptop, when an unexpected knock echoed through the silent apartment. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not my landlord. He was an unassuming man, usually courteous but a bit reserved. I hesitated for a moment, wondering what could have brought him to my door at such an odd hour. As I opened the door, I expected the usual conversation about rent or perhaps some maintenance issue. But the landlord's demeanor was different. He seemed uneasy, fidgeting with his keys, avoiding eye contact. Something felt off. He mentioned needing to check the utility meter in my apartment, claiming there was a malfunction. It sounded plausible, so I reluctantly allowed him inside. As he wandered through the rooms, something caught my eye, a glint of light reflecting off a tiny camera lens. My heart skipped a beat. In that moment, a wave of alarm washed over me. I tried to remain composed, but my mind raced. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched, that my privacy had been invaded in this supposed safe space. Trying to remain calm, I made an excuse and escorted him out. but the encounter had unsettled me deeply. I locked the door, my hands trembling as I frantically searched the rooms, looking for anything suspicious. And there it was, a tiny camera, discreetly placed in a corner, hidden in plain sight. The discovery sent shivers down my spine. I felt violated, my sense of security shattered. Questions raced through my mind. How long had it been there? What had he been recording? I felt exposed, as if my every move had been under scrutiny. The feeling of unease lingered long after the landlord left. I couldn't shake off the eerie sensation of being watched, even when I was alone. Paranoia crept in, and every corner of the apartment seemed to harbor hidden eyes. I couldn't ignore the unsettling evidence. My trust in the landlord had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing fear of what else he might have installed or what he had seen. I took down the camera, trying to erase any trace of his intrusion. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, sent my heart racing. The realization that someone had been monitoring my private life, recording my every move, was chilling. The next morning, I contacted the authorities, explaining the situation in detail. They arrived promptly, taking down my statement and inspecting the camera for evidence. They assured me they would handle the matter seriously and launched an investigation into the landlord's conduct. Days passed, filled with an overwhelming sense of vulnerability and fear. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched, even though the camera was removed. It felt as if the apartment, once a haven, had turned into a prison of paranoia. The investigation revealed a history of the landlord's invasive behavior, his illegal surveillance not limited to just my apartment. He had installed cameras in multiple units, invading the privacy of numerous tenants. It was a chilling realization, understanding that my sense of security had been breached, along with those of so many others. The landlord was charged and subsequently arrested for his violations, but the fear he'd instilled lingered. I moved out soon after, unable to shake off the haunting feeling of being watched. The once familiar walls of my apartment had become a haunting reminder of the invasion of privacy I'd experienced. That unnerving encounter with the landlord had shattered the illusion of safety in the place I called home. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying threats are the ones that lurk within the familiar, the ones disguised as friendly faces and trusted spaces. There's something calming about being alone, just me and the quietness of my home. But one evening, that peacefulness was shattered by a series of ominous texts that left me terrified. It started innocently enough. I was lounging on the couch, scrolling through my phone when a message popped up from an unknown number. It was cryptic, just a string of numbers and letters. I dismissed it as a wrong number and carried on, but the texts kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. The messages were bizarre, almost like puzzles, with snippets of information that made no sense. Some contained references to places I knew, events I'd attended, even intimate details about my life that left me cold with fear. It felt like someone was watching my every move, someone with a disturbingly intimate knowledge of my life. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it might be a prank or some sort of spam, but the texts were too personal, too detailed. Each message felt like a chilling reminder that I wasn't alone, that someone out there knew everything about me. As the texts continued, my anxiety skyrocketed. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, and the thought of someone lurking in the shadows, observing my every move, sent shivers down my spine. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and incredibly paranoid. I double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, yet the fear persisted. Every shadow, every creak of the house sent my heart racing. The texts were relentless, each one delving deeper into my life, unearthing personal details that I hadn't shared with anyone. It was as if the sender was toying with me, playing a twisted game that I couldn't comprehend. I tried to call the number, but it was always unreachable. I considered contacting the authorities, but what could I tell them? That someone was sending me cryptic texts that made me feel like I was being watched. It sounded absurd even to my own ears. As the night wore on, the texts became increasingly menacing. They hinted at a connection that I couldn't comprehend, mentioning events from my past in an eerie and disturbing way. It felt like someone was digging into my history, uncovering secrets long buried, and using them against me. Every sound outside made my heart skip a beat. I was on edge, constantly checking the windows, looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to appear in the darkness outside. I started doubting everyone, suspecting even my closest friends. Paranoia clouded my thoughts, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't awaken. With each passing text, my fear escalated. It felt like an unseen force was closing in on me, threatening to expose the darkest corners of my life. I felt helpless, like a pawn in a sinister game orchestrated by an unknown adversary. The night seemed endless, filled with dread and uncertainty. I was engulfed in fear, unable to sleep, unable to find solace in the familiarity of my home. Every shadow seemed like a potential threat, every noise a harbinger of something sinister. I contemplated leaving the house, seeking refuge elsewhere, but the thought of stepping outside into the unknown darkness was equally terrifying. I was trapped, isolated in my own home, haunted by the relentless messages that seemed to know every detail of my life. As the night crept on, I felt a suffocating sense of dread. The texts had taken over my life, transforming my sanctuary into a fortress of fear. I was a prisoner in my own home, held captive by an invisible enemy. When dawn finally broke, it brought with it a sense of relief. The messages had stopped, leaving me drained and exhausted. I spent the day on edge, anxiously waiting for any sign of the sender's return, but there was nothing. In the days that followed, the texts remained silent. I tried to move on, to regain a sense of normalcy, but the fear lingered. I never discovered the identity of the sender, and to this day, the memory of that terrifying night haunts me. I've always lived a quiet life, content with my own company. But lately, things took a strange turn. It started a few weeks ago when the community leader, Mr. Wilson, started showing an unusual interest in my affairs. He dropped by unannounced, offering help with odd jobs around the house. At first, I thought it was just neighborly concern, but as the visits became more frequent, I grew uneasy. Last night, it was different. It was darker outside, the usual tranquility of the night disrupted by an odd stillness. There was a knock on the door, and I hesitated before answering. It was Mr. Wilson, but there was something off about his demeanor. He seemed agitated, his eyes darting around, and his usual genial smile replaced by an unsettling grin. He started asking peculiar questions, probing into personal matters that were none of his business. His tone grew increasingly insistent, almost demanding. I tried to politely excuse myself, but he persisted, stepping closer until I could feel his breath on my face. It was uncomfortable, and I started feeling a sense of unease creeping in. The atmosphere grew tense, and I realized something was terribly wrong. His demeanor was no longer friendly, it was menacing. I could sense an underlying threat in his words, and a knot of fear formed in my stomach. My instinct screamed at me to get away, to protect myself from whatever was brewing beneath his unnerving facade. I tried to reason with him, to calm him down, but my efforts were futile. His behavior became more erratic, almost predatory. It felt like he was cornering me, closing the gap between us until I was backed against the wall. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was acting this way, but every fiber of my being screamed danger. I managed to slip past him, the adrenaline fueling my escape. I locked myself in a room, heart racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Fear pulsed through my veins as I heard him pacing outside, muttering incomprehensible words. The night dragged on, and I could hear him lurking around the house. I was terrified to call the authorities, afraid of what he might do if he realized I was trying to seek help. I felt trapped, isolated, and utterly vulnerable in my own home. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I considered making a run for it, but the thought of facing him in the dark sent shivers down my spine. The hours ticked by, each minute feeling like an eternity, and the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, couldn't shake off the overwhelming fear that had taken root in my mind. I listened intently, every sound amplified, each creak or rustle sending a jolt of terror through me. I felt like a prey being hunted by a predator. Eventually, the first light of dawn peeked through the curtains, and the house fell silent. I cautiously ventured out of the room, relieved to find no sign of Mr. Wilson. But the horror of that night lingered, a constant reminder of the chilling encounter that had turned my safe haven into a place of terror. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of being targeted by someone I had once trusted. It was unsettling, knowing that the community leader, a person of authority, had turned into a menacing figure lurking in the shadows. In the following days, I kept my doors locked, constantly looking over my shoulder. I avoided any encounters with Mr. Wilson, and his sudden absence from the neighborhood only heightened my unease. I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't managed to evade his disturbing intentions that fateful night. The incident left me shaken, robbed me of the sense of security I once felt in my own home. It was a chilling reminder that danger could lurk where you least expect it, even within the supposedly safe confines of a quiet neighborhood. The fear that had gripped me that night refused to dissipate, a haunting memory of a chilling encounter that had turned my world upside down. I live in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, and life has always been fairly quiet around here. But one night, I experienced something that shattered that tranquility. I was home alone, just unwinding after a long day of work. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the rooms, and I was settled on the couch, scrolling through my phone. There was a sudden knock on the door. I hesitated, not expecting any visitors at this hour. Peering through the peephole, I saw a group of 3 people standing on my porch. They seemed oddly out of place, their clothing dark and their faces obscured by hoods. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't ignore them, assuming they might need help. As I opened the door cautiously, their demeanor seemed friendly, but there was an unsettling intensity in their eyes. They greeted me warmly, introducing themselves as members of a community group, mentioning they were doing outreach and looking for new recruits. At first, I entertained their conversation, but something felt off. Their questions became increasingly probing, delving into personal beliefs and opinions. They tried to entice me with vague promises of a better life, an exclusive community, but their pitch felt rehearsed, almost scripted. It was all too perfect, too practiced. As the discussion continued, their tone shifted, becoming more insistent, pushing me to consider joining their organization. I tried to politely decline, feeling a rising sense of unease. Their demeanor grew more aggressive, their smiles turning into predatory grins. Sensing danger, I attempted to end the conversation and close the door, but they refused to leave. They began to crowd the doorway, their demeanor turning menacing, their intentions suddenly clear. They wanted more than just recruitment, they wanted to force their way in. I could feel the fear welling up inside me as I realized the gravity of the situation. I tried to push the door shut, but they were stronger, pushing back with a chilling determination. Panic surged through me, adrenaline pumping as I struggled against them, trying to keep them out. In the midst of the chaos, I managed to slip away and lock myself in a room. I could hear them outside, their voices rising in anger, pounding on the door, demanding to be let in. Their words were filled with threats, their intentions unmistakably malevolent. Alone in that room, fear gripped me, making every creak of the floorboards outside seem like an imminent attack. I could hear them trying to break in, their persistence terrifying. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed emergency services, desperate for help. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, time seemed to stretch endlessly. The seconds felt like minutes, the minutes like hours, my heart racing with every passing moment. I couldn't help but imagine the worst-case scenarios, envisioning the horrors that awaited if they managed to breach the door. When the police finally arrived, the group had disappeared into the night, leaving behind a sense of terror that lingered long after they were gone. I explained what had happened, but there wasn't much they could do without any clear identification of the individuals. That night changed everything. I couldn't shake off the fear, the realization that danger could come knocking at my door in the form of a seemingly innocuous group. I installed extra security measures, double-checked the locks, and constantly scanned the neighborhood for any sign of them. The incident haunted my thoughts, making every sound outside my door a source of anxiety. I couldn't trust the safety of my home anymore, always wondering if they would return, their intentions more sinister than mere recruitment. The fear of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are not with supernatural beings or mythical creatures, but with the dark intentions of other people. It was a nightmare that made me question the true safety of my own home, leaving a chilling mark on my sense of security that I knew would take a long time to fade. I live in a quiet suburban area, where the days usually pass by without much excitement. But one evening, that changed. I was home alone, finishing up some work on my laptop when I heard a knock on the door. It was already quite late, and I wasn't expecting any visitors. I peeked through the peephole and saw a man standing there, holding a clipboard and wearing what looked like a company badge. I cautiously opened the door, and he introduced himself as a surveyor conducting a neighborhood survey. He seemed professional at first, explaining that he needed a few minutes of my time to ask some questions about the local community. I obliged, thinking it wouldn't take long. As the conversation progressed, his questions became increasingly personal, delving into details about my daily routine, my neighbors, and even the security measures in my home. It felt intrusive, but I tried to maintain a polite demeanor. Yet, something about his probing questions and intense stare sent shivers down my spine. I tried to steer the conversation back to general topics, but he persisted, getting too close for comfort, invading my personal space. His inquiries started sounding more like prying interrogations, and his demeanor turned from friendly to unnerving. I grew increasingly uncomfortable, feeling a sense of unease and vulnerability. I made excuses to end the conversation, but he persisted, refusing to leave. He started making veiled threats, hinting at dire consequences if I didn't comply with his inquiries. My heart raced as I realized the situation had taken a dangerous turn. I attempted to close the door, but he forcibly blocked it, his demeanor now aggressive and menacing. Fear surged through me, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew I had to get him to leave, so I tried to assertively demand that he go. But he wouldn't budge. His tone became more threatening, his words a mix of intimidation and coercion. I felt trapped in my own home, powerless against a stranger's invasion of my space and privacy. With each passing moment, my fear intensified. I tried to keep a level head, not wanting to provoke him further, but the situation was spiraling out of control. My thoughts raced, considering my options, feeling a sense of desperation and vulnerability. In a moment of panic, I fumbled for my phone, ready to dial emergency services. But his sudden movement startled me. He lunged forward, attempting to force his way in. I stumbled back, locking the door just in time. The sound of him pounding on the door echoed through the house, his voice rising in anger and threats. I could hear his demands to be let in, promising consequences if I didn't comply. It was a nightmare unfolding before my eyes, and I felt utterly helpless. I quickly called emergency services, explaining the situation in frantic words, my voice trembling with fear. As I waited for help to arrive, I barricaded myself in a room, feeling the weight of terror bearing down on me. Every sound outside the door sent shivers down my spine. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The arrival of the police was a wave of relief, but the man had vanished into the night by the time they arrived. I explained what had happened, but without any identification or clear information, there wasn't much they could do. The incident left me shaken to the core. I installed extra security measures, checked the locks multiple times a day, and avoided answering the door to unexpected visitors. The sense of violation lingered long after that night, the fear of an unknown threat lurking in the safety of my home. I couldn't shake off the feeling of vulnerability, knowing that sometimes the scariest encounters are not with supernatural entities, but with the unsettling intentions of people. It was a night of terror that made me question the sanctity of my home, leaving me haunted by the chilling reminder that danger could come knocking when least expected. As I sat in the living room, I heard something out of the ordinary, the sound of faint crying coming from the direction of my next-door neighbor's house. Concerned, I paused for a moment, unsure if I should intervene or respect their privacy. After a few minutes of deliberation, I decided to check in and make sure everything was okay. I approached their door, gently knocking and calling out to ask if everything was all right. There was no response, just the eerie echo of my voice in the silence. Feeling uneasy but not wanting to intrude, I assumed they might want their space and headed back to my place. Hours later, long after the incident was pushed to the back of my mind, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, a man stood there, looking quite concerned. He introduced himself as a family friend of my neighbor, explaining that he was checking in after hearing reports of a distressing noise coming from their house. I shared my earlier experience of hearing crying, explaining that I had checked but received no answer. The man's expression shifted, and a sense of unease crept in as I noticed a flicker of concern mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. He seemed almost hesitant to leave, pressing further about what I might have heard or noticed. His questions became more probing, and I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense of discomfort settling in. I began to wonder if there was more to this visit than just a friendly check-in. I tried to politely excuse myself, feeling increasingly uneasy about the situation, but he persisted. His demeanor turned more insistent, almost demanding, and I started to feel a sense of danger creeping in. His questions grew more pointed, probing for information that felt invasive and unnecessary. I began to question his motives, feeling a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. There was something off about his persistence, his demeanor turning from concern to something far more unsettling. I felt a chill run down my spine as his line of questioning turned more aggressive, almost accusatory. The man's insistence that I provide more details about the noises from my neighbor's house seemed odd. It was as if he was trying to piece together something, but his intentions remained cryptic. I realized that something wasn't right, that his presence here held a threat I couldn't quite comprehend. My instinct screamed at me to end the conversation and retreat to the safety of my home. I attempted to close the door, but he pushed back, his foot wedged in the doorway. Panic surged within me as I tried to force the door shut, my heart racing with fear. In a tense moment of desperation, I managed to close and lock the door, my hands shaking as I backed away. The sound of his insistent knocks reverberated through the house, his voice escalating into a mixture of anger and threats. I immediately called the police, relaying the distressing encounter, and barricaded myself inside, fearing what might happen next. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, trembling with fear, for help to arrive. The police response was swift, but by the time they got there, the man was nowhere in sight. I recounted the chilling encounter, explaining every detail to the officers, but without any identification or clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The incident left me rattled and paranoid, second-guessing the safety of my own home. I double-checked the locks, peering out windows, feeling the weight of an unsettling fear that lingered long after that night. The chilling encounter was a stark reminder that danger can lurk behind seemingly friendly faces, and sometimes the scariest threats are the ones that walk right up to your door.